Today I'm going to show you what's inside of the Subaru EZ30 engine and how it works. Now this is a Boxer 6 engine, which means you got 3 pistons on either side that are horizontally opposed. Now I pulled this out of a 2005 Subaru Outback with 300,000 kilometers on it because it had an overheating issue that I could not diagnose. I did all the compression checks, coolant pressure check, and borescoped inside of the engine. I couldn't find what was wrong with it. So we're going to be tearing this thing down so we can see if we can find the failure. Now don't jump to conclusions. Just because it's a Subaru, that doesn't mean it's going to be ultimately a head gasket failure. Now the H-6 engines are actually known to be the more reliable of Subaru engines. This thing actually drove pretty nice and smooth. Until it overheated, of course. Unlike the EJ Boxer 4 engines, this one's actually got a timing chain instead of a belt, and the water pump is powered by the chain, unfortunately. It's also got a split aluminum block as well as aluminum heads on either side, and a plastic intake plenum. Around the back here you can see the drive-by-wire throttle body, which connects to the plastic intake plenum. On the side here we've got 3 ignition coils as well as the fuel rail, because this is port injected only. Then we're going to start this teardown by removing the air intake. Anyways, we're going to disconnect this connector here. Here we got a couple of coolant hoses going to it, another vacuum hose here. Pull off this little accessory bracket. I find the name of the game is 12mm sockets for most Subaru engines. You know how hard it was to remove the other side in the car? And before you guys ask, this engine is going to become my next coffee table because it's chain driven instead of belt, and it's got 6 cylinders instead of 4. I just hate it when it gets stuck to this socket. Now we're working on the driver's side. That one's stuck, buddy. Alright, now I'm going to remove the intake. And there's the harness. So just before I remove it, this here is where your fuel line connects up to over here, and you can see this is the cross pipe that goes over to the other side for the other fuel injectors on the passenger side. So I'm just going to go ahead and remove that, as well as the engine wiring harness next. You guys don't need to watch me pull out hoses and wires, otherwise this would be like a 2-hour video. Finally got this snake of wiring off the top of the engine here. We can remove that, sell that to the scrap people. Across the top here we have a coolant crossover tube that shares coolant between the two sides. Pull that off. Now this is how an oil cap should be designed. You got all of these finger grips here, making it easy for you to spin this off, not opposed to those tiny little ones that are so hard to get off and get stuck. Next up, I'm going to pop off the injector rail here. Once again, these are all 12 mils. Ooh, lots of gas in there. While we're here, I'm going to zip off these coils. There was no misfiring, so I know these work. I'm going to take off the fuel rail on the passenger side, and I'll take off the coils. Now I'm going to work on the timing cover next, so I'm going to first take off that crank bolt, which I broke loose before putting this thing on the stand, and pop off the harmonic balancer. Now I've got about 256 10mm bolts going all the way around to hold the timing cover on. Alright, so I lied. These are actually not all 10mm bolts. They're mostly 5mm hexes going all the way around, which sucks because they're very easy to strip. So before I start, I'm just going to come in with a little brake cleaner here and my wife's old toothbrush that I stole from the medicine cabinet, and then just brush these bolts so that I don't get them stripped. Alright, let's see if I can get these hexes off. Alright, so I'm having a hard time trying to break some of these bolts free because they seem like they're just stripping out. So I'm going to have to figure out another way, like gee, with a torque socket or something. Okay, I got a T40 Torx. I'm going to see if I can hammer this in here. Nope. Yeah, and obviously when I turn off the camera, then it's going to work. I'm going to have to go around and do this for all of them. Alright, so I think I've knocked all the bolts loose. I'm going to go ahead and spin these off. Now I should be able to get this timing cover off. Oh no, there's a mess. Alright, so now that the cover's loose, I'm going to go ahead and pry that off. That's with the inside of the timing cover. And here we have the Subaru H-6 engine's timing chain setup. Just like any other Boxer engine, we've got intake exhaust on the driver's side and intake and exhaust on the passenger side. Now the timing chain is going to start over here at the crankshaft. We've got an internal oil pump over there, and that's going to directly drive the camshafts over on the driver's side. For the passenger side, however, there is an intermediate idler gear here, which are going to drive the intake and exhaust on the passenger side. Now here you can see the timing chain slides. Some of them are backed with metal, and some of them are just plastic, and the 2 tensioners, one over here and one over here. So just 2 timing chains on this guy. I'm going to just loosen everything, and I'm going to loosen all the pulleys with the timing chain tension still on there. Okay, I got that one. See if I can knock this idler bolt off here. Next I'm going to remove the tensioners. This is actually a spring and hydraulically actuated tensioner. Kind of went flying. Timing chain, passenger side. Take off the chain on this side here. And I'm going to remove this idler here. And the hex over here. This guy. And there's the water pump. Now one of the last suspects in the cooling system to check would have been the water pump, but because it's located behind the timing chain, it's not that easy to pull out. It's pretty much a pain to do because you got to take all this stuff apart. Now I do see that it is functional, it does rotate freely and all the fins are present, so I don't think that was the issue of the overheating. Now there's two 5mm hex that hold on this little slide here in between the cam gears. Take this guy off. Nice thick timing chain, look at that. Same thing over here on the passenger side. And then we can take the chain off. Next I'm going to remove the variable valve timing gear and the exhaust cam gear. Next up I'm going to remove the rear timing cover, which is one giant plate because I can't get the heads off without doing that. First I'm going to remove all these 5mm bolts that go around this oil pump over here. Alright, next I got to get all these 10mm bolts for the head around off. It's actually nice how they have all the bolts labeled over here. 41, 40, 38, 33. I'll remove the bolts on the driver's side now. Two more bolts along the bottom here near the oil filter. Alright, there's a bunch of 6mm hexes going around where the water pump's at. Alright, I'm going to start by giving it a pry. Oh, that hurts. So I'm trying to take out all these hexes around the oil pump here, and once again they use stupid hex bolts and they're stripping out, so I'm trying to use my Torx to get them out. So now that I finally got the oil pump loose here, and there are no hidden bolts back here that I can see holding the timing cover onto the block, it means that I just wasted a whole bunch of time. I have to just keep prying. But why is it so much easier now? Did those bolts go right through? Ah, they probably went right through. Alrighty. So now that we've got all the timing components removed, I'm going to work on removing the driver's side head next. I'm going to pop off the valve cover first. These are mostly 10 mils. This engine is going to win an award for the most bolt head stripped here. See if I can get this off with a 9. Okay, I got the 9mm on there. Pretty sure this is just going to strip out. Yeah, kind of gave up with the amount of stripped fasteners in this engine. Alright, now with those fasteners removed, I should be able to pop this valve cover off. Well, the rest of it broke off and I can unscrew this piece. This side just sits behind the wheel, so I can assume it's probably full of salt and corrosion, and that's why these bolts were seized. Well, t-shirts are always the best way to soak up any oil inside of here. Taking a look under the valve cover of the EZ30 engine, you can see at the top here we've got the intake camshaft, and at the bottom here we've got the exhaust camshaft. Over here you can see the oil feed line that goes to this solenoid here for the variable valve timing on the intake side. But what's more is on the back of the engine here we have this mechanism, which is kind of like a VTEC solenoid. That's right, this engine actually has something kind of like VTEC, it's variable valve lift, where you have two different cam profiles over here, and instead of engaging them with rocker arms like Honda does, Subaru has opted to engage them with the little bucket that's down here, which is hydraulically actuated. Just going to remove that oil line here, and then I can remove that oil line. Now I'm going to go ahead and remove all these cam caps here. I gotta say, there's quite a lot of lines on those camshaft bearings and the camshaft itself, but this has 300,000 kilometers. Otherwise, there's not that much tarnishing in here. Alright, so it looks like I can't continue any further because there's these two 12mm hex bolts and I don't have a 12mm hex socket, and they're hiding bolts underneath there that are going to be part of the main cap, so I'm going to have to order that tool and come back in a bit. Alright, meanwhile, let's see if we can get the passenger side head off over here. I'm going to get the oil line off for the variable valve timing. Next I'm going to take off all the 10s. Hopefully these don't round out. I'm not even going to try to extract bolts this time. Alright, I might have to break this one off as well. Yeah, I really like to break stuff. Condition wise, we're looking pretty much the same under here as the other side. I'm going to go ahead and zip off all these 10mm cam cap bolts here. Guy up. You can see it's got extra channels in here for the oil passages to flow. Now I can remove the intake camshaft and the exhaust camshaft. So now that the camshaft's removed, you have a closer look at those buckets here that are adjustable for the lift. So the head bolts on these are a 10mm hex. So we're going to go ahead and crack these all loose. Now I'm just going to spin these off. Taking a look inside of these combustion chambers, things are actually pretty normal in here. There's a little bit of oily deposits and a lot of carbon inside of here, but that's actually pretty normal because this is a higher mileage engine. Now I don't notice any of these pistons being cleaner than the others, like as if they were steam cleaned, which tells me that the coolant probably did not mix with the combustion chamber. Now what's interesting to me is all this white stuff inside of the cooling jacket going all the way around, and given that it's starting to build up some crust here, I'm pretty sure that that's come stop leak or something like that, or additive that they put inside of here before I got this. And the situation gets even worse when you look inside of the head here. Take a look at those coolant passages, just how blocked up it is with that stop leak stuff or whatever crap they put inside of that radiator. It's so clogged up in there, the cooling system just won't have the capacity to flow properly and cool this engine down. And this, my friends, is why you should not use stop leak in your engine, because it completely clogs up all the coolant passages. And take a look at the actual head gasket. I examined it and I didn't notice anything compromised between the combustion chamber and the cooling side, but if you zoom in here you'll see that there's so much crust built up on this gasket. It is likely just some stop leak or something like that, and that's causing the cooling system to not be able to function properly because it's all blocked. Just kind of sad that that engine could have been saved. Now, as to what caused that overheat, I did notice there was a busted radiator cap on here with no valve or spring, and of course that white stuff littered all over the engine bay. So thanks to Amazon's one-day shipping, I was able to get the hex socket 2 days later, go figure, and it's actually cheaper to get an entire set than just 1 or 2 sockets that you need. Alright, so I've ordered me a 12mm hex socket. I'm going to put that in there and crack these caps off on the driver's side. Now I can get these 10 mils that were hiding under there. I don't know why they had to put those hexes there to hide it. And now I should be able to pry up on this cam cap. Just remove the exhaust camshaft. Quite a bit of lines on there, as well as the intake camshaft. Boy, look at the lines on this guy. Now I'm going to crack the head bolts loose. And now I'm going to zip off all these head bolts. Taking a look under that head here, you can see that the pistons do have quite a bit of carbon buildup and a bit of oily deposits, which is somewhat normal for a higher mileage engine. You can see around the coolant jacket here we do have that white deposit going all the way around. Some of it's starting to get a little crusty here, but not nearly as bad as the other side. Looking under the head here, you can see all the combustion chambers look normal. There's no evidence of coolant leaking into the combustion chamber as if one of these were steam cleaned or something. Now, inside of the cooling jackets in the head here, you can see they're not nearly as clogged up as they were on the passenger side, but there is those white little deposits in there. Head gasket looks pretty normal on this one as well. I don't see anywhere where it was compromised, and you can see there is a little bit of crustiness, but not nearly as bad. So now we're going to turn the engine over and make a mess. And here's where you can see how these engines are longitudinally mounted with the engine mounts on either side. You can see this stud here stripped in the car, and I had to cut the subframe to get it out. Let's get these engine mounts off. At the bottom here we do have a stamped steel oil pan, which is supposedly all 10mm bolts, but I bet you my wife's going to call me in for dinner before I get all of these bolts off of these oil pans. See, just like that, they're all stripped out and rusted. This is where the 9mm socket actually comes in handy. Take out stripped 10mm ones. Right, so I'm going to pry up this oil pan. I mean, for 300,000 kilometers, this oil pan looks pretty healthy. There's a little bit of grums at the bottom here, and the magnet actually doesn't look too bad. I'm just surprised that they included a magnet on an oil pan. This is supposed to be an access port to the bell housing bolts. Garbage. You know, the oil pickup tube doesn't look clogged, but it does have this piece of RTV inside, and this RTV around here does not look factory. There's just like way too much of it going all the way around, so this pan's been over sealed, and that's what happens when you put too much RTV. It can actually clog your oil pickup and starve your engine of oil. I'm going to remove the oil pickup tube. Oh my god, I lost my 10mm socket. See if we can get the little snaker and get it out. I got the bolt. I got it. Now this oil pan looks like it's going to be more headaches because all of these bolts going around here are 6mm hex. So I'm just going to use my wife's old toothbrush here to brush off all of this stuff so we can hopefully get most of these off. So I finally removed all the bolts on this upper oil pan, and I noticed that some of them have this thread locker on them, but the thread locker is placed so far up that it doesn't even engage with the block, and that's why the thread locker looks pretty much brand new and untouched. Most of the other bolts do not have thread lock, so go figure. Started. Awesome. This is quite a big heavy piece, especially for not supporting any crank bearings or anything. And my toothbrush broke in the process of cleaning those bolt heads, just like my brother would break if you gave him too much grapes to eat. So here we have a good look at the crankshaft and connecting rod assembly. Now, because this is a boxer engine, 3 pistons are going that way and 3 pistons are going this way, which means that these connecting rod caps are a little bit difficult to get to. You could probably get to the top one, but that bottom one might take a little bit of flexing. Now, just like other boxer engines, this engine block is actually 2 pieces and they're bolted together. You can see the seam over here. So once you split the block, you'll be able to take out the crankshaft. But before we do that, we got to take out the piston heads. Now, on either sides of the block, there's a secret 14mm hex that you're supposed to to remove here. Hopefully this should give us access to the wrist pins. And if you look inside that hole, you can see that there's a little circlip there we can remove to get the wrist pin out. There's a little circlip thing. I have to take this off the stand so I can hopefully get the wrist pins out and get this disassembled. Okay, I opened up the access port at the back here, and then I tried to put my tool in, but as always my tool is always too short. So instead I got a prop rod over here, and I was able to punch the wrist pin out the front. There we go. And there's the piston head. I had to use the long needle nose for the circlip on that middle one. Now taking a look at the piston tops here, you can see it definitely has a lot of carbon buildup on it, and it could have used a good cleaning. Looking over here at the oil control rings, however, they actually aren't clogged up that much. It probably wasn't burning that much oil, and definitely had some more room for oil to flow down. Now this block is made of two halves that encompass that crankshaft in between, and if you look inside of the water jacket here, you can see that there's actually 10mm hexes going all the way around that hold these two halves together. So I'm going to go ahead and use my breaker bar and start breaking them out. Probably best if this thing was still on the engine stand. Alright, see if we can zip these off now. There's also a bunch of 12mm bolts across the top of the block here. I'm going to break that free. I'll go ahead and zip those off. Pop off the rear main seal and lift off that crankshaft. And with that crankshaft pulled out, you can see that the main bearings actually look pretty clean, especially given the age and mileage of this engine. There's some minor wear, but not too bad overall. Alright, now I can finally get these connecting rods free. These are all 12mm bolts. So these are not sintered fractured. You can see the rod bearings have a little bit of wear on them. Again, not catastrophic, but definitely a little bit of higher mileage. Also to note, most other connecting rods are sintered fractured, which means that they're forged and they're purposely cracked here, so all the cracks line up when you push this together. These are separately forged, and then they've put these little notches in here as well as these little nubs so that they line up together and form that perfect circle. Now because this is a Boxer 6, you have a pair of pistons here that are more or less horizontally opposing each other. Now there is a slight offset in between these two, so they're not perfectly opposing each other, but that can be disregarded given the size of the overall engine. Now having both of these opposed to each other is pretty good for engine balance, because essentially you have two 3-cylinder engines kind of interlaced to each other on one crankshaft. You also notice you don't really need much of a counterweight over here. Again, that's because these pistons are helping to balance each other out. Also, the firing order is pretty unique here. It goes 1, 6, 4, 2, 5, 3. Now unlike an inline motor where you'd probably share a crank pin together, this one's actually horizontally opposed, and that's why it's called a Boxer and not just a flat 6 engine. The main advantage is this thing's actually pretty lightweight for a 6-cylinder. Now the upper oil pan on this engine plays quite an interesting role. If we start here at the oil pickup tube, you can see that it plugs in down there. You can see that the oil is going to flow in through this channel over here, where it's going to go into the block, then into the timing cover, where it's going to go through the oil pump and then get pumped back down in through the block again, and then into here. The oil is then going to follow this oil galley over here, where it's going to come to the oil cooler and filter assembly to get filtered out. That filtered oil is then going to come back through the oil galley just below at the bottom here to this hole over here, where it's going to go into the block to feed the main oil galley, which runs along the length of the block for the crankshaft. Now what complicates this thing a little bit more is that it actually functions as a coolant crossover, where it takes coolant from one side of the block to the other side of the block. Now if we flip this over here, you'll see that on this side here it's just capped off, but over on this side here is where the thermostat will live, and then up at the front here is where the water pump would plug into. So this is actually quite a significant functional piece, even though it just looks like an oil pan. And now we come to the engine block, or blocks as I should say, because there's two of them, just like your parents. Now at the bottom of these blocks, this is where that oil would come in and then go into the timing cover, and then on this side here is where it would come back from the timing cover and then go back into the upper oil pan. This is something I really don't like what manufacturers are doing, because if these little O-rings start to fail, you have multiple interfaces here where you could potentially spring a leak and lose oil pressure. If there was a way that they could have made the system a little bit easier, maybe by extending the oil pickup tube to come straight to the oil pump, that would be a lot more risk-free. Now these two holes are what's going to hook up to that upper oil pan to cross over coolant to either side. Now on the driver's side head here, you can see this is where the filtered oil is going to come across through this oil galley over here, and all of these are tapped into the crankshaft so that it can lubricate both the crankshaft on this side and this side, as well as the connecting rod bearing. Alright, so one thing I'm having trouble figuring out is the fact that there's no oil sprayers inside of here, so I'm wondering how exactly these pistons are going to be lubricated. Now on some cheaper engines they do have a little sprayer over here on the connecting rod that takes some of that oil pressure from here and just sprays it all inside of the piston and the wrist pin. In this case though, there is holes on the wrist pin, but exactly no means for it to get all the way up there. The only thing I'm seeing though is that there's a slight notch over here that might take oil from this connecting rod and just spray it up inside of the cylinder. Let me know in the comment section if I'm missing something. Now if you follow all the holes on the front of the block, they eventually lead up to this timing cover over here, which is also a functional part of this engine. Now, a couple of the oil galleys on the front of the block here actually lead up to this timing cover, which is a functional part of the engine. Taking a look at this giant timing cover, you can see we've got an oil pump housed inside of here. Down over here is the hole for the hydraulic chain tensioner. The other hydraulic chain tensioner, which resided over here, is actually part on the upper oil pan. If you remember, the water pump was a little bit crusty. Well, that's actually a lot of crust, but it wasn't leaking. You can see that's the weep hole that would lead directly down if bad things started to happen. That way you would have coolant on that side, and hopefully it wouldn't leak into this chain system over here and mix with the oil. I also don't like the idea of having a pump, which should be a service item, inside of this chain cover, because you got to do a lot of work in order to change that out. Here we could take a look at what that oil pump looks like. Taking a look inside of the oil pump here, you can see it's very simple. You just got an inner gear and an outer gear. Oil is going to come in from over here and just push its way out through here through the momentum of the crankshaft, which is directly keyed to, and then come back out to exit the back here. The oil pump cover is not very interesting at all, with the exception that it has like 17 bolt holes on it. And I hope you guys are still watching, because I pretty much bought this car for this really unique engine to learn how it works. Next up, we move to the engine heads here, and as you can see, we mentioned earlier, this thing's absolutely caked and clogged inside of here. I can barely get this out with my screwdriver. Probably the reason why this engine overheated so much. This is the passenger side head. This is actually pretty caked. Well, dang, I wonder if any vinegar or CLR or something would have cleaned this thing up externally without opening the head. That would have been cool to find an experiment on, but again, I couldn't see this with the borescope inside. All I saw was these valves, and they look pretty good. I don't think any chemical would have helped that, besides just getting in here with a pick, cleaning all these crusties out. Now I got to open the radiator just so we can see if that's also clogged as well, because I can't trust that. Otherwise I just give it to someone I don't like. Kind of like what happens after you get a kid. You get rusty, and other things get dried up and pretty crusty. There's so much crust on this radiator, I'm going to go ahead and cut it open so we can see what happened inside. Now, taking a look inside of the radiator, I was poking around, and there are some evidence here of some foreign material used. You can see it's all crusty in here. Further near the bottom of the radiator, you'll notice that there's a lot of that white powdery stuff. Other than that, it doesn't look completely clogged. I was able to flush most of this radiator out when I was doing my diagnostics anyway. Taking a look inside of the ports there, you can see things are pretty clean, and that's because this has port injection only right at the top here. Up at the front of the head here, you can see this here is where the oil would enter in from the block. Now at the top of the cam cover here is where you'd have the intake, variable valve timing camshaft, and the actuator sitting over here, and that's all oil controlled. Now the star of the game is actually this variable valve lift system, or VTEC if you Honda boys want to call it. Remove this VTEC solenoid. At least this one's not leaking, unlike a lot of Hondas. Honda should take note and use these proper metal gaskets as opposed to those rubber ones that always leak. Now underneath there you've got two oil galleys, one that's going to supply the oil and one that you're going to send the oil to, and then of course the drain over here. Now the solenoid that sits here is going to take oil that comes in from over here, which is the main oil galley that runs along the head, and distribute it to either this side or this side over here. Taking a look inside of this bucket here, you can see that there's a hole over here, and there's a hole over on this side here, which is drilled into those two galleys that run along these buckets over here. Now if you look at the bucket itself, you'll see there's a hole that corresponds on this side and one that corresponds over on this side. Now these are keyed over here. You can see there's a little hole for it, and that's keyed to this little bucket over here. Now once oil pressure builds up, this little centerpiece is going to pop up. You can kind of see I can barely push it out with my hand against the spring pressure. Now normally speaking, this little cam bucket over here is going to be following along the cam profile over here, moving up and down, pushing against the valve stem. However, once this little centerpiece here pops out with hydraulic pressure, it's then going to engage with this smaller cam profile here and then push the valve down a little bit less because it has a shorter throw. Now you also notice there's three different cam profiles here. The two bigger ones are on the outside, then the one on this side of the valve is a little bit larger than the one on this side of the valve. Sorry Honda, but I think this is a much more robust and simple design to have for variable valve lift than that whole rocker arm system that they have for VTEC. Now the last little thing to mention here is the intake. Now this doesn't have any active valves inside, just a simple drive-by wire throttle body, and it splits off to the 6 cylinders. However, one thing to note is that it's pretty tall, which means that you have a lot of room under here for leaves and rats to make nests and whatever. Now before you say I took apart a good working engine, you saw the crust in the cylinder head. This thing was overheating after about 5 to 7 minutes. I did a pressure test, coolant test. I went in there with the boroscope. I did a compression test. Any test you can think of that I've done, short of actually opening up the engine and cleaning it with a screwdriver, I actually did it. So I did my diligence and I tried to save this car. Now, I had quite a lot of fun taking apart this H-6 engine, and it is pretty unique. However, there was some challenges with those stupid rusty bolts. I do think this is quite a unique engine. However, we can definitely tell why it's discontinued just because of the size and the packaging. Try to fit that in the engine bay, and 6-cylinder engines are a dying breed anyway. Now, if my wife would let me, I'd probably make this thing into my next coffee table, being 6 cylinders, sitting nice and low. But make sure you subscribe if you want to see more videos just like this one.